Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Lorenda Calvert, and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar topic is Events and Programs Reimagined for the Digital Landscape. This webinar will be presented by Michael Unger. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn here in mutual respect and appreciation. We also recognize the traditional lands of the many nations across British Columbia where the works of the projects described in this webinar have been carried out. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our webinar sponsor today, Lucidia. Lucidia is a software solutions company based in Richmond, BC. They develop collections management software systems that are suitable for libraries, archives, and museums, both large and small. Lucidia's motto is, redefine how knowledge is shared, which is quite fitting for our webinar sponsor. We thank Lucidia for supporting BCMA as we seek to share knowledge through our webinar series. And as I mentioned, I am Lorenda Calvert, your host for today. I'm also the BCMA's Programs Coordinator. I've been with the organization for just over 2 months now, so please bear with me if there are any technical challenges. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, please do email our office. Vanessa, our Operations Manager, is standing by to assist. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you are reading this slide and hearing me talk, you are doing great. If you can't, don't shut out your screen because we won't be able to hear you. Simply use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. It may be hidden, so if you hold your mouse either at the top or bottom of your screen, the feature menu should emerge. Please use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments. I will read your comments or questions out to the host. Michael's just going to provide an introduction, and then we'll get into our discussion and Q&A. So just save those questions a little bit into the middle to end of the webinar today. This month's presenter is Michael Unger from the MacMillan Space Centre. Michael Unger is the Programs Coordinator. Now, Michael, I'm going to pass it on to you to introduce yourself, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. Like Lorenda introduced, I am the Programs Coordinator at the MacMillan Space Centre, and I am also one of the co-bosses for Nerd Night Vancouver. And both of those organizations, can be talking about basically events, programs that have now transitioned into a digital world. And this is going to be a dialogue because we're right in the middle of something right now, and I think all of us here, if you've joined this this webinar, you're interested within your own organizations, the types of ideas that you could use to transition your programs into a digital world, and not just a digital world, but programs that you can continue in the future, because a lot of the things that we're putting in place now are probably going to be the normal for the next little while, and maybe even longer than that. So today, the theme really that I want to kind of talk about is talking about audiences, and something in that all of us public programmers, when we get together and chat, we're always talking about our audiences, and within each organization, of course, we have different audiences, but the one really unique thing that we all share right now, and our audiences are all sharing right now, is that we're all experiencing a very traumatic event. And that is very unique because this is something that I don't think anyone in North America has really experienced before, this collective experience, and it's affecting us all in this traumatic way. And the one thing that I want to acknowledge with our audiences is acknowledging this trauma with a very important audience, and that's all of us, the people that are in our organizations, and we're trying to figure things out. Now, a few months ago, when a lot of this first happened, I think you probably remember some of the emails that started popping up in your inbox from like the banks and a lot of random technology companies that you're on their mailing list for. And they all kind of like had this same refrain, which was, we're here for you. We want to acknowledge that we are in these unprecedented times. And the more I read those, the more angry that I started to get. I started to get frustrated. And the more I thought about that is because I'm in the middle of this traumatic event, and I didn't really have a way to talk about what was going on. And that's something that as our organizations, is important to think about, because left and right, we're seeing colleagues, we're seeing organizations that are completely changing. We're seeing colleagues lose their jobs. We're seeing organizations that may start to close. And this is really frightening for us. And that's something that we can't just bury. And as we go forward and start to think about programs, we have to acknowledge this shared traumatic experience we're having, but do it in the right way. So those emails that were coming in, of course, those started to pepper my ideas of how do we talk about this in a respectful way. Of course, we want to do programs for the public, and how do we bring this all into our dialogue? And that was weird. But we had those conversations, and of course, this is a big purpose of what we're having this webinar today. I've been on more webinars in the past 2 months than I've ever had in my whole life, just talking about these issues. And I think it's really important. I'm happy that you've joined this webinar. And as we get into like the middle and last portion, I would like to hear from all of you out there about some of the things that Lorenda and I are going to talk about. And we will make it very conversational. And Lorenda and I have known each other for a while as we work on various projects together. And we're going to make it conversational. And I certainly welcome all of your questions as we get into it. So the two things that we can sort of like start off by talking about, which is what the Space Center has done, and also what Nerd Night has done. I'll mainly focus on the Space Center because that's the museum world, but I will just briefly mention about Nerd Night and what that is. So Nerd Night Vancouver was a live event that we held in a bar, Fox Cabaret, and the whole idea of it was that we had short science and art talks in a very casual space. And that space that we created allowed for really fun, nerdy discussion on these topics in a place that was kind of unexpected. And that's something that a lesson that I'm thinking about how to recreate those spaces now that we can't gather. And it was sad. I was really looking forward to all of the events that we had planned for this year. And again, that's traumatic. I'm thinking about all the events that we had planned for the Space Center that we had all canceled, traumatic event. How do we recreate some of those spaces in a new digital way? So with Nerd Night, Kaylee Byers, who's my co-boss, we both decided that we didn't want to do Zoom webinars because the whole point of Nerd Night was that we were together with people with a drink in our hand talking, and the Zoom webinar just didn't fit that. That basically became a TED Talk, which is great, and I love watching those. That just wasn't what Nerd Night was, and what our audience why they kept coming, to the Fox Cabaret to experience that. So what we did was that we sort of started again, and a lot of our organizations are in that mode. We have to start again. And what we decided to do was to create a podcast. And of course, when we first started, we have, very high expectations of ourselves, but then quickly realized that a podcast is very different than a live event in a bar. But that's fine. It was really fun. And we're learning new skills. And it was tricky because we don't want to start from the bottom again and learn these new things, but we kind of have to. And it's okay. And as long as we talk about, our experiences and what we're going through, eventually we'll, start to climb some of those skill ladders, and we'll get a little bit better at it. And it'll be okay. So that's Nerd Night. And if anyone wants to sort of like talk about, the specifics of podcasting, I'm happy to talk about it. But with the Space Center, we were doing a monthly public event that was sometimes focused on families, sometimes focused on adults. And we've done a couple of those already online. So the first one that we did, which was our Cosmic Night. Cosmic Night was our adult 19 plus event. creating sort of the experience of the Space Center. But because we had a liquor license, we really focused in on more of an adult learning experience, and allowing adults to be kids again. And we would delve deep into subjects, and we'd have a featured speaker, we'd have demonstrations and activities. So we experimented with transitioning that event online. Our first one was Earth Day, Cosmic Nights Earth Day. We had Joanna Wagstaff from the CBC join us as our first featured guest, and we did it in Zoom. So we had me, our astronomer Rachel, and also Joanna, and we started off with discussions around the themes of Earth Day. And we had a little activity that we sent people out that people could share their art, because that was one aspect of the event. I wasn't sure how well that would work. It worked okay. But one of the things that I learned from that event was that we discovered that doing an event on the internet for a specific audience means you're probably going to get more than just that specific audience. And we quickly realized that a lot of the adults soon realized that there was a lot of teens on the chat, because we were Zooming to YouTube. And so you could see the chat going. And of course, to facilitate, really interesting dialogue, adults kind of like can feed off of each other. But once they saw the teens in there sort of asking silly questions, all of a sudden, I think that the vibe kind of like shifted a bit, and they could say, oh, okay, this is more of like a family event, which is a little bit different than the vibe that we would have for our audience for those adult events. So that's something that we're working on, and we're doing another one coming up, which is going to be a little bit different. We're going to have it inside Zoom, and we're going to have people be inside the Zoom webinar, just like we're doing now, and then we'll be able to share that conversation that we're going to have, which is going to be on black holes later on for the public to watch. So that's all brand new. These are all things that we've tried and we're transitioning. We also tried that with a family audience, and we did May the 4th Be With You, the same format. And we went Zoom to YouTube, and it worked quite well. But of course, trying to figure out who these people are that come to YouTube to watch your events, you need data, and we don't have enough of that data yet. The more events that we do, we'll start to understand this audience, because it's different than the audience that we had cultivated with our in-person events. And, I think that conversation is really valuable right now with all of your organizations. If you have started to do some of these online events, talking about the people, the audiences that are coming to these events, I think that's a really important conversation that I'm actually really interested in. And I think will kind of be what we're going to talk about with me and Lorenda. Did you want to jump in here, Lorenda?
Absolutely. Michael, I would love if you're able to share, just for everyone who's joining us, because I was able to join for the May the 4th event, which is fantastic, and kudos to you and the H.R. MacMillan Space Centre. I'd love to know some information about the background of like how you settled on these events, or the format, and how they came to be, if you're interested in sharing.
Yeah, so we went through a process, a learning process, because there's lots of options out there. I don't think I had heard of Zoom at the beginning of March. And then, of course, at the end of March, I was well versed in what Zoom was. So the first question was, what platform should you use? And that was a discussion that we had. And of course, we're trying to make a decision, which is like, let's pick one. Because then we'll get better at it. But of course, when we're doing these events, eventually we're starting to think about, the school programs and how we're going to do these digital events later on the fall. So we really wanted to kind of have something that was going to work for all of these things. And so that was, we took our time to kind of like figure out how we wanted to do that. And so we decided on Zoom, because it seemed to be the easiest one to use, and it also had the feature that you're using right now, which of course is Zoom to Facebook. And so then that brought up the other decision, which was Facebook or YouTube, because Zoom has a function where you can pick one. Now you can do both, you need extra software. We're looking at the software called OBS, which can enable you to go from Zoom to Facebook and YouTube, and I think maybe even some other platforms as well. Now, the challenge that we had with that is that you need somebody monitoring those chats. And I think, Lorinda, you have a separate person that's just on Facebook right now that's just looking at those questions. And so the question is, do you have enough staff to help you with that? Do you have enough people, still in your organization, still working with your organization that can facilitate all of those live chats? Because you certainly need them. And we certainly realize that even in our YouTube lives, even having like 2 people on there, even just having someone to answer the questions inside the chat, because we found, there were some really interesting questions, but they might not have been on theme, but it's a good question. And it's good to have that question answered maybe by somebody inside the chat, and then somebody that's also curating, okay, let's bring this question into Zoom and focus it there, so that the conversation just doesn't start to go wild, which sometimes as your audience starts to grow in numbers, you're going to get a lot of those wild questions and perhaps even inappropriate questions. We've had them. You can imagine that when you open up your events to the internet, you're going to get everyone.
Completely true. Absolutely. You got to watch out for that. I would love to know if you're interested in sharing what your numbers have been for the events, if you'd like to dive in.
Absolutely, yeah. So for Cosmic Nights, we got about 350 people at our peak, which I was blown away by, and I actually didn't know until after the event. It's very surreal, to be in my kitchen and all of a sudden thinking about all these things that I'm doing with the event, because it's just me, kind of like I'm a producer. It's like we're a TV show here. And I kind of started to think of it like Wayne's World. And that helped me a lot because I kind of wanted to have my own TV show. And, I think tapping into a little bit of that sort of DIY, ad hoc, just do it kind of mentality excited me. And I think that helped because, like I said, we're experiencing a traumatic event right now, and tapping into something that excites you, I think your audience will start to see that. And so 350 people, at our Cosmic Night event for Earth Day was a really wonderful to see. Really wild because in our program plan at the beginning of the year, we weren't going to market it as Earth Day. I didn't think that Earth Day in 2020 in January was a theme that was really going to bring out that many people. I thought, well, if we're going to try to gather 400 people inside the building, we might have to slightly tweak the theme. And so we had thought about calling it Space 2099. So it's kind of the Earth's place in the solar system in the future. So we'd be talking about Earth, but we kind of framing it in sort of this futurist way. But then, when this all happened, I thought, what? In a weird way, I think Earth Day kind of helps us, that theme brings us all together. And it's something that I thought would be, people would resonate with. And I was glad to see that people would. And Joanna, who is so wonderful, she thinks about these things because she's a scientist, even though she's a meteorologist on CBC, but she's got an award-winning podcast on climate change. And she was able to sort of bring her humble personality and brevity to a really trying situation to talk about, that the Earth has gone through these traumatic events in the past, and humanity has gone through, these events in the past before, and we'll do it again. And that was a really nice message. And I think I really liked that message. And I think a lot of the audience did as well.
I agree. That's a really nice message. I appreciate, because Earth Day is in April. So we were well into this experience, this trauma that we're all experiencing. And I can appreciate that if you continued with the theme of what does the future hold, when all of a sudden we'd all lost the footing we had about what the future held, that would have been a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
I would love to explore, because I was a participant, a viewer for your May the 4th event, and
Mhm.
you had some technical challenges, which I will say that you handled very well. Would you
Well,
mind
thank you.
sharing? You're welcome. Would you mind sharing with the participants today on this webinar about that particular incident, how you overcame it, and just also those other pitfalls? You mentioned the people with the inappropriate comments.
Mhm.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I think, with that particular incident, I kind of tapped into my performing background. Um, and I don't know if anyone on the chat has ever been on stage before, but I remember the feeling. The very first play that I was ever in was Twelfth Night, and I played Andrew Agucheek. And I remember the feeling of walking on stage, looking at my scene partner, and not knowing what my line was. It was the worst feeling in the world. And I think it was good for me to have that experience, because now I know it's like, I never want to be unprepared ever again. And practice and research is something that is kind of like, it's that fear, like, I don't want to get up on stage and not know what I'm doing. I don't want to come online and do these events and not have tools that I can figure out how to solve these things. So for obviously we didn't have any technical challenges for Earth Day, but before that I practiced like all day, just sort of like transitioning things, like moving things in and out, sharing your screen, all the technical things of Zoom that I've been learning, just so that I felt really comfortable, and that if something did happen, I wasn't going to panic. And so in May the 4th event, Zoom crashed on me. I didn't realize that had happened, but I could still hear the event going on. So I quickly typed to our astronomer to ask questions for our guest that was there, Mihai from Industrial Light and Magic. And I was kind of like, just ask questions, just have a dialogue. I'm going to restart Zoom and I will come back in a few minutes. And so that's what I did. And I sort of had faith that that was the best course of action, and it worked. It mainly worked because I didn't panic, I think. And that was because I had practiced. And, anytime you're giving a online talk, anytime you're speaking with your audiences, your comfort level with technology is one of the big things that we talk about with our staff. When you're learning a new technology, just practice every day, practice with it, get comfortable with it, because these things will happen. Stuff is going to go wrong. It'll continue to go wrong. We've talked about what happens if power goes out here and I lose the internet. What happens then? We have multiple people sort of like there, but we're thinking about these things and trying to prepare for the worst.
Thank you. Just as an ambulance drives by
Yeah.
my apartment, so I'm sure
Perfect.
you can hear that. The way that you transitioned was so wonderful as a participant, because you handled it so well. I was immediately nervous for you when you froze, and I was like, oh my God, are you gonna, shut down Zoom and then the whole webinar is gonna be over? And now that I'm more experienced with Zoom, I know that you can make other people co-host, that you can leave without ending the meeting, you can transition. There's some things that once you get comfortable with the platform, just like becoming a programmer, when you get comfortable with that unexpected, you can transition quite quickly. So for those negative comments that are coming up in the chat, how are you addressing those in your events?
So the first ones weren't really negative comments. They were just teens that were fooling around. And that was something that we had discovered, that was probably a teacher that had probably sent their high school class to the event, knowing that, hey, this is a really good event that is kind of talking about a lot of the things that we're talking about in school. But it's an evening event, so it's not during class time, so they're all doing it on their own. And of course, the teens are all in there on their own, and they can see their friends. They're just being teenagers. So we quickly figured out that you can mute people on the chats in YouTube. You can even kick them out if you need to. Those are all things that we learned on the fly that are certainly good features to use, especially when people are being inappropriate like that. And then of course, we haven't really been getting any of like the trolls so much. We have had trolls in the past, you know, especially on Facebook, you know, to the events, that people come into the events and comment things. And, you know, the way to deal with those is just ignore them. If somebody is trying to like rope you into a conversation about flat Earth or anything about vaccines and anything like that, just ignore them. And it's not appropriate to the theme. You don't need to acknowledge them. You know, well, you recognize they're a troll, and then you just send them away. That's the easiest and simplest way to deal with that.
I think that's great advice. I also, because I've had some stuff come up in chats, and I've, you know, muted them, kicked them out of the chat. But I've also addressed it in the same way I would if someone in an in-person program made an inappropriate comment. Right. You know, there's other audience members. So you just mentioned, like, I don't think that's the right kind of dialogue for this webinar. And then you know, kick them out of the webinar. But just to put it out there. Now, switching gears, I'd love to know, because I registered for May the 4th, and you use Eventbrite, and it was by donation. Can you share a little bit about what that thought process was and why that platform versus others, and donation versus price?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we first started doing these events in this way, our organization wasn't set up to sell tickets online, and of course, Eventbrite is a tool that you can use. Now, it costs money. There are, you know, a few things that you have to consider when you start using Eventbrite. But for us, because we didn't have that infrastructure, it was a really great way to just easily sell tickets online, and then we can figure out how to bring people in. Now, when we transitioned to the online events, we wanted to be consistent with that for our process, because a large part of what we do is gathering emails for people that are interested in these events, so that we can also send them our newsletters for the future events that we're going to. So we want to start gathering this data that we're talking about with our audiences. And Eventbrite has a lot of really interesting tools that you can gather those emails and then have them send them information. So for instance, with the May the 4th Be With You, we had people sign up with a so with the ticket, and the donation feature is right there, and it's really easy to use, and that made it a lot easier for us to make that decision. Like, how do could we generate revenue with these events? You know, we don't want to say that. We don't want to say, you know, we want to be respectful, you know, in this traumatic event, that some people aren't working, that they're, you know, just scraping by. But with the Eventbrite, it was there as an option, and you could use it and give us a few dollars if you could. If you don't, then that was fine. And it was all right there. We didn't even have to talk about it very much in the event, and it worked really well. And that's all. And the other aspect of that is that we're also able to send our surveys out to the participants, which I'm sure you probably filled out, Lorenda, because you are a survey nerd. And that helps us as well, getting feedback after the events. And that's all part of the data collection that is important as we go forward.
I do appreciate, I got the email that thanked me for my participation. Because it's donation based, I had the option to request whatever it is that when you do taxes, you can say how much money you donate. So I had that option. And then also the survey. So it was lovely the day after this wonderful event to get an email saying, thank you so much for supporting us, and how valuable it was to be a participant and to be supporting the Space Center. And then, yeah, you know, it's like receiving a thank you letter or a thank you card. It's just always nice.
Yeah.
I'd love to, you know, please. No.
Well, I was just going to jump on that, because that brings up an interesting point about why we're doing live events in the first place. Because we could, you know, make videos, put them out on our social media channels, and have people watch that content. But the whole point of, I think, why museums and science centers should still do live events is to have that conversation and that real experience. And that's something that I think a lot of people are missing right now, is that shared experience. So if at all possible, doing live events on a consistent basis is something that I think organizations can do. Now, it's tricky, as like I said, like you need staff resources, you need to have a little bit of money to kind of like get Zooms or these things, but there are ways. And I think there's a lot of value in continuing to have a dialogue with your audience right now. And I think, and we're doing that right now too. Like we could have pre-recorded this conversation and put it out onto, the BCMA website, but no, we want to talk with everyone that's out there.
I completely agree. I love that dialogue. And actually, I think this might be a good moment to pose a question from the chat.
Yeah.
We have a question from Nicole. How do you best utilize the skills of your staff who may have different levels of skills/comfort with virtual programming and tools? And then the second question is, are there any tips you have to ensure that everyone is included and feeling confident?
That's a great question. And actually something I didn't actually talk about before, which was one of the most important audiences that we all have is with our own staff. And checking in and talking with them about what's going on is important. But also, kind of like in this starting again mode, taking stock of who you have available and what are their skill sets. And trying not to like put somebody in an uncomfortable position, but looking to see like, okay, well, what are you really good at? Are you really good at graphic design? Are you really good at video editing, or maybe you are comfortable working with some of these technologies. Taking stock of the skills that your staff have, I think is a good place, because again, you're starting again, and you kind of have to think of it like you're a brand new business, and you have to kind of look around to sort of like see what you have, what's your product. This is going to be a new way of interacting with your audience. Don't try to force something that you think is going to work because you've seen other organizations do it really well. That may not work with you because, again, as Nicole asked, we may not have those staff resources. So talking with them to seeing what they would be comfortable with, and being open to their suggestions. I think a lot of our organizations have a certain hierarchy of like, we decide what to do, and this is how we're going to do it because we've been around for many, many years, and it's always worked that way. Well, now we're all kind of like on the same level again, and I think now is an opportunity to really listen to some of those ideas of those staff that are still around and utilize their skills.
I completely agree. I also think that there's a lot of resources out there. If you haven't poked around on the Zoom website, there's lots of videos and articles that you can provide for your staff to help them get a little bit more comfortable. You can do practice webinars or providing workshops where it's just you and your staff so that they have that chance to practice in front of an audience. Very similar to when you have new staff joining you as an interpreter at your organization. Going through that training system could be really valuable even on a digital platform. I understand that we are all facing limitations currently, so that may not be possible, but it's something that you can explore.
Yeah.
Question.
I'll just add, before we did any of those events, we did practice run-throughs. Like the weeks leading up, every morning, we did a full run-through of the events. So for any of the organizations out there, that might be just something, if you think that a lot of your staff are not comfortable, maybe just set up just have like a bunch of practice sessions and not have it be specifically for an event. Just start to build some of those skills for later, knowing that you may need to utilize some of these events later on in the future and develop some of those skills for them.
Absolutely. I have two questions, Michael. I'll do one and then the other, and then we can open it more officially to the chat and Q&A function here on Zoom. I'd love to know first about marketing, and then I'd love to know about partnerships. Can you tell me a little bit more about how the Space Center has marketed what you have going on, or if you want Nerd Night for the podcast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, marketing is something as public programmers we have like an interesting relationship with, because it's a separate department, and we kind of work in conjunction. And again, there needs to be a lot of dialogue, and we certainly try to like be in close contact with our marketing team about what we're doing. because you have to remember that because we're doing new things, marketing also needs to know exactly what's in our head with when we're doing these programs, and being very clear about what our intention is, what the program is. And and also with marketing, the flip side to that is that it's also kind of experimenting, and we're trying new things. A lot of it, everything is online right now, a lot of digital marketing. But as we know, the best marketing tool that any of us have is word of mouth. And again, who are these main audiences that we have that can be our champions? Well, that's our team. That's the people that are closest to us, our board members. And bringing those people together and saying like, hey, we really want to pump this event. Can you send people that you know, people that you think would really enjoy this event, and using those channels. And creating that sense of community, because I think a lot of our museums have a lot of, they have a lot of goodwill that people, they feel good about supporting. And I've been hearing a lot of that people that I've been asking to be participants in our events. They're like, absolutely, because they recognize that organizations are being hit really hard right now, and they will be for a while, and they don't want to see our organizations go away. I don't think anyone out there is like, well, screw those guys, I'm suffering, they're suffering too. No, I think like there is a lot of goodwill out there. You just have to ask for it. And if you're not comfortable with asking, it's something that you can, that I've learned in the past few months, was like, you'll be surprised at some of the responses you'll get by just asking for something that you didn't think you'd get a yes answer to before. I certainly learned that when I emailed Industrial Light and Magic. I've emailed them before, but I suddenly realized like, oh, they're not really working on very much. And actually, yeah, they would love to be part of May the 4th Be With You event. I was like, whoa, like there was a big response. There was like, they had to like filter out people because they all wanted to be part of the event. So that's a lesson that can be learned right now, is that ask for help. It's we're all here to support each other.
That's wonderful. I think that actually answers the question I had about partners, because you had Industrial Light and Magic for the May the 4th, which is the company that does the editing for Star Wars movies and The Mandalorian as well.
Yep.
I think they also did Harry Potter from my
oh yeah, they're one of the biggest.
My realm of nerd content. And I really love that just reaching out and seeing what the answer is. If you can build that connection now, that's amazing, especially assessing the fact that they themselves may not be working on the projects that they would have had, so that they're interested in just putting that out there. I think that's amazing. If you hold on for just a second, I'm just going to share my screen to remind folks on how to use the Q&A function. Just give me 1 sec. So at this point in time, we are inviting participants to please post your questions in the chat. If you're listening live on Facebook, you can post them on Facebook, and we have someone who will relay them to us. If you are unable to find the chat, try hovering your mouse at the top or bottom of your screen. You may only find the Q&A function. You can pose your question in there as well, and I will read that out to Michael. I'm going to go back to our videos now, so let's just give me a second. So Michael, we've got some questions coming in. I think we've answered some of them already about how many people are showing up to public events compared to in person. We answered Nicole's question. So one question here about the podcast from Gary. Our museum is considering starting our own podcast. Can you talk a bit about your experience with starting this, including any challenges? And also, who did you find your audience were?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that we learned early on was that the podcast audience is different than our in-person experience. And of course, obviously not everyone listens to podcasts, but people that do love them. I'm one of those people myself. Like, I love podcasts, but I can't just assume that everyone that would have come to Nerd Night is also going to be one of those people. But our event was very focused on people that lived in Vancouver. It was Nerd Night Vancouver. But now you're doing a podcast, and now your audience is the whole world. So one of the things that we did was we created a new brand. So Nerd Night Vancouver was the name of the event. Our podcast was called Nerding Around. So it's a compendium. So it's it's not going to be the same experience. It's going to be a new thing. And we're still going to delve into our topic. We're going to have one speaker, but we still have a lot of the familiar things that people would have recognized from Nerd Night. So one of the things that we do in the event that has been working well in a podcast, which is just take a sidebar on like the main topic of the podcast and just talk about what we personally have been nerding out about in that past week, which often ends up being, you know, what TV shows we've been getting into, or what other science or hobbies that we may have. And that's been working really well. So, you know, when we first, so if you're a museum and you're thinking about starting a podcast, you do have to recognize that what your attention is. You know, do you want to create a more global brand? Because that is going to be more of your audience when you create a podcast, rather than focusing on local. Because obviously your audience is going to get a lot smaller if you're just trying to get a local podcast audience. But of course, when you first start out, you know, word of mouth, you know, marketing, podcasts, there's a lot of competition out there, you know, so you have to recognize that you're going to be very small on that rung, on that ladder, and you're going to have to build up slowly, just like you would with any other business.
Thank you. We do have a question here from Gabriel. What size of a team are you working with?
Great question. You know, we had a bunch of interpreters that are furloughed right now. So currently it is Lisa McIntosh is our director of learning. And then Trish Pattison is a other programs coordinator. So there's two of us and our astronomer. So we've got a team of 4 that are basically doing these events.
You're doing a wonderful job, all 4 of you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. A question here from Darren. How can interactive experience be tailored to an online audience?
Yeah, another good question. And we've been figuring that out as we've sort of, as we've talked about. The different platforms have different ways of interacting. So we're here on a Zoom webinar and we're using the chat and the Q&A function, I think, really well. And I think a lot of people are getting used to this kind of interaction. Now, I actually just got off of a call. The Canadian Association of Science Centers is having their annual awards this Thursday. And one of the cool things that they're doing is that they're having breakout rooms and having AMA style discussions around a topic. And so I'm going to be moderating one of those small rooms. So there's going to be, you know, 300, 400 people that are going to be coming to the CASC Awards as they announce their best exhibits and things like that. But one of the cool features that you can do with an add-on feature is to create these breakout rooms to have these smaller discussions. And I think that's really cool. I've not actually used that myself with the Space Center. I've seen that with some other events, and that's, you know, that's a cool way to, I think, have an even more intimate discussion with your audience. So there's many different ways of going about that. You know, the way that you're doing it right now, Lorenda, you know, pulling from Facebook, pulling from YouTube, those are all great. You can do as many of them, but you do have to remember about your staff resources and how many people you have on your team to facilitate all of these. And then, of course, surveys afterwards, talking to people that were a part of the event. Did they like that? Did they, were they hoping to have something else as part of the event? The more data you can gather after these things, the more that you can improve upon your events.
I also want to add, for the May the 4th, you had pre-sent out on social media, and I believe an email as well, once you registered, instructions on how to make a craft that was going to be part of the experience. And it was a Yoda headband, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think one of the follow-up surveys was asking, did you end up making the craft? So not only was it interactive in the moment in the experience, I think during the chat, you asked anyone if they had made them, and people were engaging in the chat about how much fun their children had making their headbands. But you also had pre-sent this activity that not just dialogue, but actual hands-on experience that could be done by home, which I really, really appreciated.
Yeah, one of the things that I think we're going to experiment with the next Cosmic Night is one of the things that I would put up during the event would be a question that I would pose and then a bunch of Post-it notes so people could write answers to. That's a common thing that I see in a lot of museums. So I think we're going to do that with our next Black Holes event. I'm going to ask, a really geeky question that I know is going to get a lot of fun responses that will create sort of like just a really fun atmosphere. Because you have to remember, a lot of times in your topics, they can be very serious. And I think that trying to create that vibe when you're in-person event of having like something that's a little bit fun and that gets people to be creative inside your event. I think people appreciate that. So we're going to experiment with that.
That's cool. I'm looking forward to that. We have a question here from Michael. I work at a center that primarily does programs for families with children. We've been doing online content with a mix of facts, graphics, videos, and activity sheets. Sounds amazing. Way to go, Michael. Tons of fun stuff. We try to market using our website and social media, but it doesn't generate much attention. Do you have any other suggestions for generating interest while still being close to the public?
Yeah, and I think, again, that gets back to asking for help. And if you think about sort of like, do you have local TV stations? Is there anyone in the local media that might be able to pump up, some of these events that you're doing? Again, maybe some of these asks would be too much a few months ago, but now I think is time to maybe ask some of those people to see if you can help you out to amplify. And you'll be surprised, honestly. And even like, I think with other organizations as well, like reaching out to other program coordinators, maybe in a different city, because remember, your online events are now more than just, your local community. You have a broader range. So, if you can find people in maybe some other areas of the province that they might be able to share with their audiences, you may start to get some responses there too.
I also, from personal experience, specifically with child programming, there is a lot of, mostly it's on Instagram, but there's also blogs and Facebook groups specifically for parents, parent support groups, or just often like basically social media influencers, but they're parents. And if you're able to reach out to them, they've got very wide audiences. They're super passionate about child engagement, stuff that their kids are interested in. And just starting that dialogue and seeing where you can go with that can be a really good resource. Yeah, now, Michael, absolutely. We do have another question here from someone named Darren. How are museums going to monetize engagement without the normal revenue streams from physical attendance? Are you able to share a little bit of information on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, doing events by donation was a choice that we made. We made that choice because we found that we would get a better response that way, rather than setting a price. And the example that we used was when we were gathering solar eclipse glasses, and we wanted to be a resource before things went crazy and there's a worldwide shortage of them, that people could buy the eclipse glasses from us. Now, we could have sold them at cost, which was about, I think, like $5 or so. But we made the choice to just make it by donation because we wanted to make them accessible, because we certainly wanted everyone to be able to experience the eclipse. And what we found is that we made way more money than we would have if we had charged $5 per glass for glasses. And that's because some people were just really appreciative, and if they had the money, that they could give us more. So that's been, that's part of our decision around that. And eventually we will start to do some in-person programming. We've been talking about doing some outdoor programming. We haven't decided about that may be a little bit of a different model, because we will have more costs associated with staffing around doing some outdoor programming. But certainly making it accessible at this point, I think, is important. And yeah, I think we can start to have those conversations about monetizing things. We're at that place now. We don't need to be trepidatious about it. Everyone understands that if we don't make money, we're going to have to start closing doors. And so at this point, I'd say, go for it. Start to figure out ways to monetize and producing more of these programs. For us, we've realized that we can do more of these online programs because they're easier to put together, rather than the in-person programming. So before we'd have like maybe one event per month, and now we're maybe doing a couple, and we're doing our weekly live sessions every week. And all of those, the more chances that you're live, the more that you're putting out there, the more chances that you can monetize those things. And each time we do that, we try to direct people to our website to donate to us, just so that we can start to get a steady stream in.
Thank you. We have a question kind of tied to that. Are you considering approaching sponsors? And if yes, how?
Another good question. And a large part of that, is not in the department that I'm in. Sponsorships is something that it's a relationship. If you want to build, long-term sponsors, there's sometimes takes years to do. So those are conversations that the sponsorship team is having, and a lot of it is just creating a relationship. On my side, the Industrial Light and Magic partnership that we created is something that's going to continue for years. But that's a programming side. They're not giving us money. So if you're thinking about what kind of partnerships that you can create that way, is reaching out to companies that may benefit from your audience. So for instance, TELUS approached us, and we're now on TELUS Optic TV because they have channels where they were looking for content to just have science demonstrations. They have a family channel. I think there's like one streaming channel that is just all science demonstrations. And so they were looking for content, and we were like, well, we might be able to provide that for you. And at the moment, that's not monetizing, that's not creating, that type of like large sponsorship, but eventually it might, and that's a whole other like side of it, because those bigger sponsors take time and relationships to develop, and you may need to start to be patient around those, but certainly something that is important right now.
Absolutely. So you got your Wayne's World now. This is your Wayne's World. That's excellent. We have a question from Facebook. Do you think you will adapt your digital programs for schools in the fall, and what might that look like?
Talking about what we discuss every week in our meetings, because this is what we're talking about. And it certainly looks like the more information that we get, that schools are not going to be coming for in-person visits in the fall. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can, like we were doing virtual field trips before, and that would be like a 45-minute session that we could do in our science theater. And but the more information that we get about what schools are going to be like, and that may be different for different districts. So one thing that I have heard is that the class is going to be half size. So there's going to be some kids in the classroom while some kids are going to be digital. Well, that makes it tricky, to try to do a program, for some people that are in the classroom and some people that are online. So we're discussing, like, do we do it twice? Do we do, when you make a booking, do you make it for a Tuesday for the people that are in the class, and then again for the Wednesday they're in the class as well? Of course, that means completely restructuring, what you charge for those events. But, that's the task at hand right now, because obviously that's a big part of our revenue streams, and that is something that we'll be focusing on. And we certainly know from the teachers that we've been talking to that they still want to figure out a way to include us. They had plans, to visit our Space Center, and a lot of the topics that they discuss, they're looking for help on, and that's why we're here. And so we just need to adapt to that. And certainly it's a shifting place, because as teachers sort of figure out what they're doing, we want to be there in that conversation to figure out how we can support them best. So we're having that conversation right now. Those are some of the ideas that we have, just knowing that for us here in Vancouver, we're probably not going to see in-person field trips soon.
And that actually, as we approach 1 o'clock, brings up one of the questions I wanted to chat about. Now that we are reopening and this mixture of in-person and distant, what does the fall or future of programming for you folks look like?
Yeah, it becomes sort of like a hybrid. And within that, probably, you know, some of the roles for people are going to change, because you're going to need to kind of reassign people, and know that you're going to need to do some digital events, but then you're also going to have some in-person events. Do you separate those in terms of like, you're only going to be open to the public to come visit on certain days, and maybe those days are different from the days that you know that you're going to be doing digital events? And that all comes down to the resources that you have. And these are tough decisions to make, because, you know, obviously you need to pay everyone. And it's almost starting again, and kind of getting back to what the theme was about our main event, the main theme for today, which is our audience, and that audience within our organizations, and continuing, you know, I think a close dialogue with them with, here are some ideas that we're trying out. Tell us how you think about it, because we're going to be asking you to maybe do some different things. And we would like to maybe develop some skills for each of you that are going to be new skills for you. Are you comfortable with that? And those conversations, I think, should be happening now, especially as we get closer to those times when we are going to be reopening. For us, you know, like, we're going to experiment a bit in the summer with outdoor programming, you know, but at the fall, it could be a hybrid of all of it, right? Because for me, especially, I think a lot of the audiences that we're developing online, we need to keep going with that. And keep developing those audiences, because, you know, there's going to be a lot of people in the public that aren't going to be comfortable with any kind of in-person programming. So doing a hybrid of all of that, but also making sure that you're not stretching your organization beyond your limits, and burning people out. Certainly there's a danger of that too.
Thank you. Just under the wire, we got 2 more questions off of Facebook.
Let's do it. Rapid fire.
Are you going to decide to not book any in-person programs at all for schools, or do you think you will book for the possibility of in-person and then adapt as needed?
Wow, we really got the big questions here. That's an answer that I don't think I can answer, because that, you know, that depends on the infrastructure you have in place. Are you making your institution safe for not only the people coming, but also for your staff? Is that a possibility? I think those are the questions that the management, you know, in your organization need to ask, and need to figure out if that's feasible, if it's financially feasible to do those things. And again, not stretch your organization beyond your limits. So I don't know what the answer to that is. Certainly thinking about it. At the moment, it looks like because we're a planetarium, we fall into phase 3 for British Columbia, which is theaters, which is a bit different than maybe other organizations where you could just galleries where you could wander through. So for us, we're taking a much more cautious approach, just knowing that people will be a little bit more apprehensive to sit in a planetarium in the future.
Thank you, Michael. We have another question from Facebook saying, I'm not based in the Lower Mainland for school programs. Would you then be more available for rural communities to book programs?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is again an opportunity, you know, to expand your audience. And there's a lot of things that I think as an organization, if you've been kind of talking about, always wanted to do, now's your opportunity. You always wanted to reach out. You always wanted to expand your audience to the rest of the province. Our province is huge. It's giant. You know, it's hard to travel around our province to all of these communities. But now we have that opportunity. And now if you can focus a little bit more of your resources on the online programming, then it's going to open up those audiences. So yes, absolutely. Now's the time to do that for sure.
Wonderful. We have 2 comments that just came up in the chat that I'd love to share with you, Michael.
Sure.
One of them is from Gabriel saying, so great to have theater people working at museums. So way to go. And also from Christine saying, not a question, but a comment. Thank you so much for taking away my fear of the great unknown of online programming. Your honesty and enthusiasm for embracing new ways is greatly reassuring, which I think is the loveliest comment to end today
Absolutely.
on, because I echo those sentiments. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your enthusiasm and just encouraging. And, you know, I hope everyone is inspired by you as much as I am and looks at what they can do for their Institute for Online Programming.
Yeah, and honestly, I've got lots of time right now, because, so if there are questions or things that people want to know more about, please feel free to share my contact information. I'm happy to chat with anyone, especially, even if you're just worried about the future of your organizations. I'm happy to be an empathetic ear to listen.
Thank you, Michael. That's wonderful. I'm going to take over the screen again for my last little bit here.
Thanks, everyone.
Past the question section. Thank you again, Michael. That was fantastic. I will be sending out a follow-up email with a recording, as well as I can include your contact information so people can reach out to you. I just wanted to share, please do join us in May. We have another webinar coming up this Wednesday on creating and engaging online projects. And please remember, if you have any suggestions for topics in 2020 or wish to present one yourself, you can email myself at programs@museumsassociation.bc.ca, and there will be a follow-up survey in your inbox soon. If you fill it out, that helps us with our webinar planning. And if you haven't become a member with the BCMA yet, please do consider becoming one. As a member, you have access to funding opportunities, free webinar participation, reduced registration fees for our annual conference, regional workshops, and other special events, access to professional development resources like our Roundup magazine, e-newsletters, job postings, and so much more. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you again, Michael, for sharing. I really appreciate it. It was very wonderful, and I hope everyone has a lovely and safe afternoon. Thank you so much. Take care.